We don't want us to live in a world in which you can change your borders by force. And so if we do not help Ukraine defend itself, the vision of the world that America wants, that America is propagating, can't succeed. Nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. Ukraine is the country that was invaded, right? They are not the ones who started this. Russia began this. I think that if Ukraine is not able to push Russia back, that is not only a loss for Ukrainian interests, but also a loss for American interests. The US is not doing enough to help Ukraine. President Trump has said that he wants peace for Ukraine. The only way to achieve peace is by pushing Russia back. The president has a very limited number of powers that are exclusively his prerogative in foreign policy. The Senate can say, no, we don't like this treaty the president put together, right? Members of Congress wants to hear from you. 91% of Republican primary voters think that Vladimir Putin is evil. Calling your congressman is actually incredibly effective. Members of Congress want to hear from their constituents. There are Republican members of Congress who support Ukraine who ask us, look, I want to vote yes for Ukraine, but all I'm getting is negative phone calls. I know that there's people who support Ukraine in my district. Why aren't they calling me? All of us, every single one of us should be calling our members of Congress at least once a week. I think it's not only the civic responsibility that we have as Americans, but it's also the duty that we have to Ukraine.
Hi, my name is Allison Rochford, and I am here in Washington, D.C. for the Ukraine Action Summit, a biannual advocacy summit that brings more than 500 people from all 50 states to advocate on behalf of Ukraine. Today, I want to talk to you about year-round efforts to advocate on behalf of Ukraine. So I am here at Razom's D.C. headquarters with Mykola Murskyj, Advocacy Director of Razom for Ukraine. Thank you so much for meeting with me today.
Of course, happy to be here.
Thank you. So can you just start by telling me about the work that Razom does in shaping U.S. policy surrounding Ukraine?
Sure. So our advocacy is based around this concept called the advocacy triangle, which is government, communications or media, and community. So we push on all three of those vertices of the advocacy triangle to try to move members of Congress, move their staff, and move executive branch employees in the right direction on Ukraine policy issues. So for example, when we're talking about the confiscation of Russian state assets, right? So the US has frozen $5 billion in Russian money that is here in the US. It's frozen. That money should be confiscated and given to Ukraine instead of staying here frozen in the US. So we pushed for a piece of legislation called the Repo Act, which will authorize the president to do this. And we used the advocacy triangle to make that happen. So on the government side, we did direct lobbying, direct advocacy. We have a government affairs team that spends all day on Capitol Hill talking to members of Congress and their staff and making the case for the pieces of legislation that we believe are going to make the biggest impact for Ukraine. On the communication side, we launched certain important and influential stories in the press, I'm not going to say which ones specifically, that moved the conversation in the right direction for particular members of Congress. Being able to place those stories in the media, in outlets that those members of Congress read that you want to affect, that really helps you push things in the right direction. And then on the community side, we mobilized local activists in key states in order to make sure that, they were pushing other members of Congress that were kind of, the blockers. There was one senator in particular that was looking to tank this piece of legislation. And so we targeted our direct lobbying, our media campaign, and also our constituent outreach, our activation of constituents to target this senator. And ultimately he relented and the bill was able to pass.
Fantastic. So can you tell me a little bit more about what goes into shaping your priorities?
Well, I mean, what's going to have the biggest impact on Ukraine? So, our task is to do everything in our power to make sure that the U.S. supports the Ukrainian victory, that the U.S. does everything that it can to help Ukraine retake territory, defend itself against future invasions, have strong institutions domestically. Our sole metric is what is going to have the biggest impact on Ukraine.
Absolutely. And so can you talk to me about how much that policy is influenced by Ukraine's goals and how much that overlaps with kind of the United States' best interests?
I think that there's actually a lot of overlap. I think that's a really excellent question. I think that if Ukraine is not able to push Russia back, that is not only a loss for Ukrainian interests, but also a loss for American interests. And so, when Ukraine is saying, look, we need to be able to strike back into Russia and be able to target the airports where planes are taking off to bomb our hospitals, it's like, yeah, like that's obviously in Ukraine's interest to be able to do that. But it's also in America's interest for Ukraine to be able to defend itself. If Ukraine cannot defend itself, the signal that that sends to Russia, to China, to other autocrats who want to expand their borders around the world is one that is grossly detrimental to the vision of the world that America wants to put forward, that America is espousing. We don't want to live in a world in which you can change your borders by force. And so if we do not help Ukraine defend itself, the vision of the world that America wants, that America is propagating, can't succeed.
Mhm. And how has Razom been navigating the shifting political landscape?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. I think that the situation is complicated. It has always been complicated, although it's more complex now. President Trump has said that he wants peace for Ukraine, right? That's something that President Trump has said. And I think that the most important thing to realize is that, nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians. Ukraine is the country that was invaded, right? They are not the ones who started this. Russia began this with its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and with its invasion of Donbass and Crimea in 2014. Ukrainians want peace. President Trump has said that he wants peace, right? So what's going on here? I think that the issue is in the fact that Ukrainians understand that the only way to achieve peace that isn't just a superficial ceasefire, but genuine, meaningful, just, and lasting peace is by pushing Russia back. Ukraine has to have a strong military that can push Russia back to regain at least some of the territory that Ukraine has lost since 2014. It's crucial that Ukraine have the Western alliance structures it needs to be able to deter a further invasion. So if Ukraine does not join NATO, and if Ukraine does not join the EU, its deterrence credibility is going to be significantly lower. And so from my standpoint, I think that all of these things are crucial conversations for us to be talking about.
Absolutely. And so, what are some specific challenges that exist right now in passing legislation that would support Ukraine? And what are some areas that give you optimism?
That's a good question. I think that the biggest challenge right now is that you have members of Congress on the Republican side of the aisle who are supportive of Ukraine, but don't think that their constituents are. I think that that's one of our biggest challenges right now. You have members of Congress from almost every single state who are voting against, or who would vote if there were to be a bill passed, if there were to be a bill introduced down in Ukraine, who would vote against it. Because they think that their constituents don't support additional aid to Ukraine. They think that their constituents are willing to tolerate Russian expansionism. And that's simply not true. We did polling in February that showed that 91% of Republican primary voters support President Trump, right? That's not surprising. 91% of Republican primary voters think that Vladimir Putin is evil. So as popular as Trump is among Republicans, that's how unpopular Vladimir Putin is. We need to make sure that the opposition to Russian expansionism that the Republican base feels is heard in the halls of Congress. That's, I think, our biggest challenge. Yeah. And the glimmers of hope, I think, are that, publicly, if you look at the public polling, Ukraine has been at relatively steady support levels for the past 2.5 years. We saw the biggest dip in support from February 2022 through maybe the end of the year in 2022. But 2023, 2024, and for the part of this year that we've already been through, we've seen relatively consistent numbers on both the Democratic and Republican sides of the aisle. In fact, we've seen a pretty significant bump over the past 2 or 3 weeks in the fraction of Americans who think that the U.S. is not doing enough to help Ukraine.
Mm.
Yep.
So, what can average Americans do to kind of support the advocacy efforts that Razom does year round?
Yeah. We often tell people to call their congressman, and then I think that people think that we're kind of giving them busy work, or they're just saying that because everybody else says, but that's not true. Call your congressman is actually incredibly effective. Members of Congress want to hear from their constituents. There are Republican members of Congress who support Ukraine who ask us, look, I want to vote yes for Ukraine, but all I'm getting is negative phone calls. I know that there's people who support Ukraine in my district. Why aren't they calling me? Why am I not getting pro-Ukraine phone calls? And that's the question that, I have to your viewers. Why aren't these people getting for Ukraine phone calls? All of us, every single one of us should be calling our members of Congress at least once a week. You're one member of the House and you're two senators, at least once a week. And you should try to see them in person at least once a month. Going to one of their fundraisers, going to a community event, or inviting them to one of your community events, having them come speak at your church or your school, and being able to engage with them in person. I think it's not only the civic responsibility that we have as Americans, but it's also the duty that we have to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on this a little bit with our last question, but something that we're hearing from our time meeting with our representatives this week, especially from Republican offices, is the balance of the role of Congress in this versus the role of the executive branch in this. How can Republicans kind of reconcile, maybe some opposition to supporting Ukraine versus it maybe being in the president's best interest?
Yeah, or his purview, right? Like this is his job to figure out foreign policy.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is certainly the job of Congress to pass law and to pass resolutions. Congress, by passing laws, articulates what is the policy of the United States. And it's entirely reasonable, and it is entirely within Congress's purview to pass laws that, for example, like I mentioned previously, authorize the president to confiscate Russian state assets. The president has a very limited number of powers that are exclusively his prerogative in foreign policy. The rest are powers that are shared between Congress and the executive branch. So this excuse that, foreign policy is made exclusively by the executive branch, that's not true. I think there is some desire to give any incoming president a lot of deference in the first 100 days or the first year of his administration or her administration. But right now, these claims that we're hearing that, it's not Congress's role to talk about foreign policy, like that is certainly not true. Congress legislates every single year on foreign policy. Yeah. I mean, foreign treaties have to be ratified by the Senate. The Senate can say, no, we don't like this treaty the president put together, right? Yeah, so I think that it's squarely within the purview of both the executive branch and Congress to be determining foreign policy for this country.
Absolutely. And is there any legislation that the American people should keep their eye on if they're interested in this topic?
Yes, there is. There is. So Senators Graham and Shaheen last week introduced a really interesting sanctions package. It has 25 Republican and 25 Democratic senators that it signed on as co-sponsors. So that means half the Senate has already co-sponsored this bill. It's incredible. So please do just Google Graham Shaheen Russia sanctions bill, and it'll be probably the first thing that comes up. Please make sure to call your members of Congress, ask them to co-sponsor it, ask them to support it. We need as much engagement around this ever as possible.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that the American people should know about, bipartisan advocacy efforts on behalf of Ukraine?
I think the most important thing for people to understand is that members of Congress want to hear from you. They need to hear from you. The members of Congress that used to vote yes on Ukraine and now vote no, the reason they vote no is because they got phone calls telling them to from their constituents. And so it is our responsibility, it's incumbent upon us to counteract that pressure with phone calls that say, yes, I demand that the U.S. do everything it can to support Ukraine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your
course.
time and for educating us on this topic.
Of course, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.